War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 23. By the time Norton finally made it out of his bedroom the next morning, Colonel Ironhorse was waiting for him. Poker-faced, the burly colonel stared down at him. "You didn't come down to breakfast, Mr. Drake. Frankly, I was beginning to get concerned." Norton curled his lips sourly at both the realization he'd missed breakfast and the patronizing remark. The colonel was just another typically ignorant non-plege, Norton's own term for anyone who walked on two legs and blithely assumed everyone else did too. Without help, it would take Norton a full hour to wash up and get dressed, even though the facilities here were great. A private toilet and shower designed for a paraplegic just off his bedroom. It was now only 9 o'clock. Norton had risen at 8, and after the sleep he'd missed lately, that was pretty damn good, even for a military type. "Wasn't in the mood for breakfast anyway," Norton snapped. Even Harrison had the good grace not to bother him before he'd had his first cup of coffee. "Did it occur to you I might be tired, Colonel? Excuse me. I'm on my way to a date with a cup of coffee." Ironhorse began to say, "We'll get you some. I'll get it myself, thank you." Norton replied rather nastily. This guy was laying on the help the crypt bit just a little too thick this morning, and still wearing his uniform. Was he expecting a surprise inspection? Maybe. "Gertrude, full speed ahead." The colonel followed him. "I was going to say, we'll get you some when we get to where we're going, but you're headed in the wrong direction." "Gertrude, stop," Norton ordered, then scowled up at the colonel. "I thought the kitchen was that way." "The coffee's this way, toward the elevator." "Elevator?" Norton's frown deepened. "You're hallucinating, Ironside. This is a one-story hacienda." "It's Iron Horse." The colonel's black eyes regarded him humorlessly. "I was going to show you your office, Mr. Drake, if you'll come with me, please." The colonel gestured for him to follow. Norton balked. "I don't need an escort, thanks. I'll find my own way around." "Do you know where the elevator is?" "Well, no, but I was going to show you your office as a common courtesy," Ironhorse said patiently, "the way I did for Dr. McCullough and Blackwood." "Oh." Norton became vaguely aware that he might have overreacted. "Well, then, let's go." But Ironhorse stood staring at him. "And I wanted to be sure you had the equipment you needed. It's my job, after all." All right. Norton waved an impatient hand at him. "Just get me to the coffee first." Ironhorse turned and headed down the hallway. "Gertrude, full speed ahead." The chair followed the colonel. At the end of the hallway, back by Norton's bedroom, was the elevator. "Handicapped access." A snideness crept into Norton's tone, one he really hadn't intended. "Very considerate of you. Gertrude, ahead 3 and rotate 180. The chair carried him into the elevator. The controls were low, easy for him to reach, and he blinked at the 3 choices: down, up, and open doors. No top floor. So he pressed the down button, and tried to ignore the fact that Ironhorse was watching him. "Chip on your shoulder, Mr. Drake?" So there it was. The colonel was just looking for a polite way to get even for the razzing Norton had given him the other day. If Norton and Harrison had anything in common besides their hatred of the aliens, it was their hatred of uptight, regulations-spouting military types. But Norton wasn't prepared to take him on without any caffeine in his system. "I'm tired." Norton drew a palm down over his forehead, eyes, and cheek. "And Harrison will verify that I'm not known for my cheerfulness before my first cup of the day." He paused, then tilted his chin up, defiantly, at Ironhorse. "Besides, Colonel Ironbutt, what's it to you? Bet you have a few chips of your own." To his astonishment, the colonel didn't take offense. In fact, Norton thought he saw a glint of humor in those inscrutable black eyes. "Just call me Chief and find out," Iron Horse said softly. Norton looked the Native American's powerful build up and down and swallowed. No thanks." The elevator came to a smooth stop. The door opened. Iron Horse stepped out. "As you can see, the elevator directly accesses your office." He turned to glance at Norton. "More consideration." Norton directed the chair out of the elevator and closed his eyes as he sniffed the air. "My God, I'm having an olfactory hallucination. That's my own private blend of coffee I smell. How did you—" He broke off as he opened his eyes and caught sight of the room around him. A slow smile spread across his face. The office was huge. Not only did it contain the same transmission equipment as his office at the Institute, and then some, but over in one corner, now he knew he was hallucinating, sat a Cray computer operator's console complete with laserjet printer. "Gertie, rotate 45 left, ahead 10. The chair rolled him up alongside the computer console, which he stroked lovingly. "Colonel, pinch me if I'm dreaming, but am I to understand that this is my very own Cray?" The barest hint of a smile crossed Iron Horse's thin lips, then vanished. Obviously, the colonel was pleased with Norton's reaction. "The computer engineers didn't have much setup time," he replied nonchalantly. "But this baby can still access the DDN, the Defense Data Network." "Where are you hiding the CPU?" "In the next room," Iron Horse replied. "I understand it's pretty noisy, and I figured you might not enjoy working at a constant 55 degrees. Like I said, if you find there's anything else you need, more memory, more peripheral storage." Norton grinned and shook his head. He'd clearly underestimated the man, so he was an uptight military buttwipe. But there was actually a working brain hidden beneath that ultra-tough exterior. "This'll do fine for now. I don't think anything else has been invented yet. What did you do, read my Christmas list?" The colonel crossed the room as Norton spoke, picked up a Melita glass pitcher, and poured coffee into a mug. "You can't be expected to do the job if you don't have the equipment." He set the pitcher of coffee back on a hot plate and walked over to Norton and the Cray. "Keep up that attitude, Colonel, and I might even get to like you." Iron Horse handed him the cup of steaming coffee. "If I can offer this as a common courtesy, Mr. Drake, without adding to that chip of yours." Norton hesitated only for a split second before taking it. Iron Horse stepped across the hallway to Dr. McCullough's office. There was something he liked about Drake in spite of the guy's smart mouth. Maybe it was the fact that, like the colonel himself, Drake had overcome the odds, had come out the victor in an impossible situation. He had read Drake's dossier. Born into a poor family which, like Blackwood's, had been killed in an alien attack that left the 3-year-old child orphaned. After that, he had lived in a children's home, then a couple of foster homes. But instead of turning sour, Drake had harnessed his bitterness and set it to work for him. The kid had been a National Merit Scholar, had won math scholarships to the best universities. Iron Horse had to admire him. Learning about Blackwood's tragic past had eased Iron Horse's contempt for him somewhat, but he doubted he'd ever come to like the guy. Dr. McCullough was a different story. Now there was a responsible, hard-working individual who would have done well in the military. Iron Horse peered into the doorway of her office and did his best to assume a pleasant expression, something he was quite unused to doing. "Finding everything you need, Doctor?" The windowless office was about 2/3 the size of Drake's. Glossy, black-topped counters ran the length of 2 interior walls. Above them, glass front cabinets displayed every conceivable type of lab equipment: beakers, test tubes, petri dishes, and a lot of instruments Iron Horse didn't recognize. The exterior wall was a bookshelf stocked with reference volumes. Next to it, in one corner, stood a computer terminal and a leather ergonomic chair. One of the cabinet doors was open, and McCullough had unloaded some instruments onto the counter and was studying them. At the sound of the colonel's voice, she looked up with a distracted expression. Give her horn-rimmed glasses and a white smock instead of the blue jeans and red checked shirt, Iron Horse decided, and she'd be the perfect caricature of the absent-minded scientist. Brains and looks, the whole package, yet the lady seemed quite unaware of it.
Yes, thank you,
Dr. McCullough answered blankly.
There are things here I don't even understand. Somebody must have spent a fortune.
Iron Horse squared his shoulders, proud that his work had not gone unappreciated. The government wants everyone happy. McCullough sighed and frowned down at the mysterious instrument before her.
I'm happy enough, I suppose. Now all I have to do is find a bacteria harmless to man, impervious to radiation, and lethal to the aliens.
She shook her head.
Maybe I should just cure the common cold first.
If anyone can do it, ma'am, I'm sure you can, Iron Horse answered encouragingly. He withdrew and headed down the corridor towards Blackwood's office. The door was closed. Iron Horse rapped on the wood with his knuckles. At the muffled, "Come in," the colonel entered. Dressed as usual, as if he were about to embark on a hike rather than research, Blackwood stood in the middle of the room, hands on hips, craning his neck back to admire the ceiling. Of all the offices, Iron Horse was particularly proud of this one. It was a virtually exact replica of Blackwood's office back at the Pacific Institute, right down to the inflatable Starship Enterprise. Basement windows too high and the views wrong, Blackwood murmured, still surveying the ceiling. And the room's bigger. But when I close the door, I can forget that I'm not at the Institute. He gave the colonel a curious look. Someone obviously wanted to make me feel right at home. A perfect copy, isn't it? Iron Horse asked, swelling with pride. Blackwood nodded and stared up again. As if my life before this thing didn't matter. He looked back at Iron Horse with an expression of wonder. Or never existed at all. It never existed, Iron Horse said with conviction. Not for any of us. After dinner that night, Suzanne sat on the living room sofa with Debbie snuggled next to her and watched as Kensington carefully added 2 more logs to the blaze in the fireplace. The room looked as if a family had lovingly decorated it with simple country furniture, even a handmade quilt draped across the back of the couch.
More coffee?
Mrs. Pennyworth gestured with the coffee pot at Suzanne's empty cup on the table.
No, thanks.
Suzanne shook her head. She was sinking into luxurious drowsiness here in the fire's warm glow, surrounded by a circle of friends. Harrison, a circumspect distance away on the couch. Norton nearby in the wheelchair. Iron Horse settled into a leather wingback chair, obviously the seat of authority. And in 2 days Clayton Forrester would be arriving. It was very hard not to feel a sense of family, of belonging, and very easy to feel safe, to forget the terror hidden somewhere outside the haven of the ranch. She reached out and idly stroked her daughter's hair, but Debbie was far too enthralled by the tale Iron Horse was spinning to notice. Even the colonel seemed affected by the mellow setting. As unfeeling and unapproachable as he seemed in his military persona, now he leaned forward in the wing-back as he spoke, a cup of coffee balanced on one thigh, clearly relishing his role of storyteller. Actually, it's short for one who shoots the Iron Horse. He was explaining the origin of his family name in response to Deb's question. I'll bet you can figure that one out. Deb wrinkled her forehead.
Iron Horse? I don't get it. Sounds like a car or truck.
Iron Horse shook his head. Nope. Think back about 100 years or so. Deb thought for a minute, then burst forth with,
I got it! A train!
Norton, who'd been close to dozing off, jerked his head up sharply. Suzanne laid a gentle hand on her daughter's arm to quiet her. Excellent, the colonel said approvingly, his black eyes dancing with firelight. Your daughter's very sharp, Dr. McCullough.
I'm afraid she knows it already,
Suzanne answered, smiling, and reached out to fondle a lock of Debbie's blonde hair.
Oh, Mom.
Deb batted at her mother's hand with adolescent disgust and asked the colonel,
Your family fought the trains?
Iron Horse nodded somberly. As the railroad moved west, it pushed my people off their land. Unfortunately, you know how it comes out. The Blackfoot tribes were spread all over Montana, Utah, up into Alberta, and now we're crowded onto a few tiny reservations.
That's awful.
Deb's eyes were round with dismay.
Is it really true?
Iron Horse's bronze features hardened. It's true, all right. I grew up on a reservation. He shifted the topic abruptly, as if it were too painful to consider for long. But where are we in the story?
Your great-great-grandfather,
Debbie prompted. That's right. Iron Horse's expression warmed. Anyway, since my great-great-grandfather was shaman of the tribe...
What's a shaman?
Suzanne clicked her tongue.
If you keep interrupting Colonel Ironhorse, Debbie, he'll never be able to finish his story.
Iron Horse smiled indulgently at the girl. While telling the story, he was transformed into a completely different person. Why? Suzanne thought, amazed. He really is a kind-hearted man. That's all right, Dr. McCullough, the colonel replied. I enjoy answering your questions. A shaman is the tribe's spiritual leader, Debbie, sometimes called a medicine man. He was the most respected person in the tribe, more even than the chief. The shaman used his magical powers to enter the bodies of animals and learn their wisdom.
Neat. You mean like if I entered Spirit's body to try to find out what it was like to be a horse?
Something like that. Anyway, the warriors brought their strange discovery to my great-great-grandfather to find out what it meant. Deb was on the edge of the couch.
What was it? The discovery, I mean.
It was a flat rock. Iron Horse drew one hand, palm down, horizontally through the air to indicate just how flat. Covered with drawings no one had ever seen before, and they were very, very old, too.
How old?
Suzanne frowned.
For goodness sake, Deb, let him finish the story.
She was actually becoming rather interested in it herself. The colonel continued, unfazed by the interruption. As he spoke, his tone became increasingly dramatic, that of a real storyteller. Older than the nearby cave drawings, or the drawings on ancient pieces of buffalo hide passed down through generations.
What kind of Oops.
Deb clamped a hand over her mouth and looked guiltily at her mother, who shook her head with a tolerant smile. There was no controlling Deb's curiosity. What kind of drawings? Iron Horse intoned melodically, tilting his head. Well now, I'm glad you asked. They were of a man wearing a bowl that covered his entire head. His eyes glowed, and he carried a wand. Suzanne shifted, unsure as to whether or not she liked the direction this story was going.
A magic wand?
Deb breathed. It seemed like magic because the wand threw out great bolts of light. The colonel paused to take a sip of coffee. Suzanne shot him a warning glance, now certain that she didn't like this particular tale at all. Surely the colonel realized that Debbie had no idea about the nature of the Blackwood Project, and that stories about aliens were bound to scare such a young girl. But Ironhorse continued, seemingly oblivious to Suzanne's disapproval. My great-great-grandfather took this rock and went out into the desert for 1 moon. That's about a month. When he came back, he gathered everyone in the tribe together. Ironhorse set his cup on the coffee table and acted out the part with sweeping gestures and a booming voice. We know that our people were the first people ever to walk this earth, the shaman said in a strong voice, even though he was weak and hungry. But others came before us.
Wow,
Deb grinned.
What did they do then?
Ironhorse finally seemed to catch Suzanne's warning look. He picked up his cup and said offhandedly, They fired him and got themselves a new shaman. The adults snickered, except for Norton, who stirred from his reverie and looked about, disoriented. Debbie groaned with disgust.
And I really thought they'd been visited by a spaceman. You made that all up.
Ironhorse's expression became serious. Only that last part.
Bedtime,
Suzanne said quickly. Actually, it was way past Deb's usual bedtime, but Suzanne had so enjoyed having Deb around that she hadn't had the heart to send her daughter to bed. But now she wanted a word with Ironhorse before any more stories about alien visitors were told.
Oh, Mom. Complain while you get ready for bed.
She gave the girl a playful swat on the bottom as Deb rose.
Now scoot.
Deb sighed.
Okay. Good night, everybody, and thank you for the story, Colonel Ironhorse.
You're welcome, Debbie. Good night. The other adults murmured their good nights as Debbie padded off to her room. Kensington, who'd been squatting back poker straight by the fireplace, spoke up for the first time that evening. You folks going to be here long? A strangely cold little man, his question came out sounding more like a challenge than a casual, friendly inquiry. Harrison looked up from contemplating the fire. We hope not, Mr. Kensington. No offense intended. Mrs. Pennyworth spoke up from her place in the armchair farthest from the fireplace, her tone as warm as Kensington's had been cool.
And none taken, Harrison. You stay as long as you have to.
She shot Kensington a dirty look. From the familiarity of her disdain, Suzanne assumed the two knew each other very well.
And what kind of question was that, Thomas?
Kensington sniffed and replied, his tone defensive. We might need to restock the pantry, that's all.
I take care of the pantry.
Mrs. Pennyworth jabbed at herself with a thick finger.
You take care of the grounds.
Kensington sighed as he rose from his place by the fire. The corner of his mouth quirked up. It could have been the beginnings of a smile or a sign of irritation. Then I guess I'd better check the security system and turn in. Good night, all. He walked off stiffly in the direction of the kitchen.
To check my pantry, no doubt.
Mrs. Pennyworth shook her head.
Colonel,
Suzanne began. Ironhorse didn't give her a chance to speak. I'm sorry, Dr. McCullough. I didn't realize when I started that the story was so directly related to what we were doing. A subconscious slip-up. I take it Debbie has no idea.
Of course she has no idea,
Suzanne said, feeling a twinge of irritation.
I'm not in the habit of informing my daughter about the secret government projects I happen to be working on.
I'll be careful about my choice of stories next time, Doctor, Iron Horse promised, his expression contrite. "Colonel," Norton was suddenly completely alert. "You believe that story?" Iron Horse shrugged. "Native American folklore, if you ask me. Nothing more, nothing less." "Funny thing about folklore," Harrison said, rising. "Almost always there's an element of truth in it." He paused to give Suzanne a look that seemed to go right through her. "I agree that your daughter doesn't need to know what we're doing, but it's hardly fair to try to protect her from history, from what really happened. Good night." They watched him leave in silence. That night Suzanne dreamed about the mysterious drawing on the rock. Chapter 24. The next morning at 8, a taxi deposited Clayton Forrester at the entrance to the Institute. From there he walked to the cafeteria and got himself a cup of coffee. He wasn't allowed caffeine, and the walk was longer than what he was used to, but it left him pleasantly winded. Besides, old habits were hard to break. For 30 years Forrester had arrived at the Institute every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, walked to the cafeteria for his coffee, then headed to his office almost a full hour before anyone else arrived. It was his favorite part of the day, the quiet time when he could contemplate the tasks ahead without interruption, the time when he got 3/4 of the day's work done. As he walked along the sidewalk through the cool morning air and stared out at the sprawling, grassy landscape, he realized with mild surprise that he, Clayton Forrester, was actually enjoying this walk, enjoying the taste and smell of the forbidden coffee, enjoying the familiar scenery, enjoying the fact that there was important work to be done. It was his closest brush with pleasure in years, and there was a faint smile on his lips. All this in spite of the totally sleepless night he'd spent. He'd lain on the living room sofa for his customary nap during Johnny Carson, and the second he drifted off, he was awakened by the screams of a frightened child. Heart pounding, he'd dashed through the shadows to Harrison's old room before he remembered that the boy had moved out years ago. He forced himself to settle back on the couch with the admonition that he needed rest. The second time he was roused by the roll of thunder. He ran to the window to see heat lightning redden the dark sky, and for an instant he'd panicked at the sight, thinking it was the aliens' death rays. After that, he resigned himself to staying awake. Yet at the same time, his horror that the aliens had returned was mixed with genuine excitement at the thought of working again. And in this morning's sunlight, the terror was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of purpose. By the time he made it past the security guard and into his building, Forrester was puffing a bit. The heart was, of course, bad, had been bad for some time. The first attack had come at age 60, and a few years back, when the pacemaker was installed. The doctor, just a kid Harrison's age, made it clear in no uncertain terms that Clayton was living on borrowed time, which suited Forrester just fine. It was the only memory of his promise to the boy.
"You're going to die, aren't you?"
"No, Harrison, I'm not going to die." That kept him from finishing off an entire bottle of sleeping pills at once and being done with it. Harrison had suffered enough for one lifetime, and Clayton refused to add to the boy's grief. Harrison already had enough guilt at being a survivor. Forrester walked silently down the hallway. The carpet was a new addition since he'd retired, into the older wing, and finally arrived at his old office. It felt right being there, even though the plastic imitation wood grain plaque on the door read McCullough now. The door was unlocked, as Forrester had known it would be. Everything of value belonging to its current occupant had been removed a day and a half ago. He turned the doorknob and entered. Clayton had packed his belongings at the house yesterday and was ready to go, but it had taken archives a full day to come up with the files, and here they were, covering the entire desktop, in topless cardboard boxes stuffed full of manila folders. Clayton walked around, behind the desk. A box rested in the seat of the swivel chair, but there was no sign of Suzanne McCullough's things. Even the photograph of her daughter was gone. Clayton had noticed it a few days before, and it had reminded him of the photograph of Harrison he'd kept in almost the same spot. It made him sympathize with Suzanne all the more. He knew the horror of trying to raise a child with the specter of the aliens hanging over one's head like the sword of Damocles. He set the coffee on the one clear spot near the desk's edge, then bent over and started going through one of the boxes. It was tedious work, and the angle made his back ache. After about 15 minutes of it, he straightened, put his hands against the small of his back, then stretched backward. This would never do. He eyed the formidable-looking box resting in the chair. He wasn't supposed to do any heavy lifting, but then Jacoby wasn't coming for another half hour, and Clayton refused to stand all that time. Besides, Jacoby was older and smaller than he was. Forrester bent down, slid his hands under the bottom of the box, and lifted it with a grunt. It was even heavier than it looked. Red-faced, gasping, Clayton slowly lowered the box. About 4 inches from the floor, he let it drop onto the carpet with a muted thud. Clayton went back and sank into the chair with a sigh, then picked up his coffee and took a small sip. Some thick-headed, muscle-bound college student who worked part-time as a gopher must have thought himself brilliant to set the heavy carton in the chair, where someone else would obviously have to. Pain blotted out the rest of the thought. Heavy, crushing pain that squeezed his chest until it pushed all the air from his lungs in one startled, frightened gasp. Forrester panted and waited for it to lessen. But instead of easing, it bore down harder against his chest, while it swept down his left arm. His grip on the cup eased. It fell, spilling scalding hot liquid down the front of his cotton shirt, into his lap, down his legs. Clayton scarcely felt it. He was too busy struggling to breathe, to hold back the growing blackness that loomed threateningly along the periphery of his vision. In the midst of the fear and the struggle, he was vaguely conscious of the irony of it all, that this should happen today of all days, when after all these long years he finally felt like living. And yet, as he looked out at the familiar surroundings, as they began to gray and dim, it somehow seemed good to have it happen here, in the place he loved best. With his other attacks, the pain had gradually eased, then faded. But this was nothing like the other attacks. The agony mounted until it reached truly unbearable intensity. Forrester raised a hand to his chest. "Harrison," he whispered. And then the darkness took over, and there was no pain at all.